The brain is the hungriest organ in the body. Only in mental health, really, do we wait for the disaster before we intervene. People who had one serving of greens per day, compared to people who didn't eat leafy greens in their later years, had brains that were 11 years younger. The higher the proportion of your diet is ultra-processed food, the lower your nutritional status.
Welcome to In Good Taste, the podcast on food matters for food lovers. I'm Malika Basu, food writer, educator and advisor, and every week we cover short and sharp topics for food lovers like me. This episode is brought to you by Loka, a beautifully designed chai maker with a bubbling no-spill fountain that keeps spices moving as they brew. It's paired with a fragrant, ethically sourced blend from Diaspora Spice Co. So every cup of calm in chaos has real depth and flavor. Now, today we have Dr. Kimberley Wilson on the show. Kimberley is a psychologist and an author who specializes in the role of what we eat on our brain. So Kimberley and I are going to cut through what we can eat and do to maintain our brain power for the future. Well, hello, Kimberley.
Hello, how are you?
I'm really well, thank you. I like that we're both in like matching orange tops today.
Yeah, and it's an unusual shade, so the fact that we've both chosen it is, I think, a good sign.
Excellent sign. Well, thank you very much for making the time to do this, because we must talk about what's happening with our brain power and how it is connected to what we eat and drink. And I know you're the absolute top dog on this subject matter. So let's take it from the top, Kimberley. When we talk about brain health, what are we actually talking about here?
So when I talk about brain health, I'm talking about three things, really. I'm talking about structure, so having a robust neurological structure, synapses, brain connections that are kind of working as well as we can expect. Then I'm talking about function. Okay, so yes, you've got good structure, but how is your mood? How is the connectivity? How is your prefrontal cortex? Is it firing? What is happening with the hormones? And then the final part is your subjective experience of your brain. How I describe it in my first book is, can you trust your brain? Do you feel that your brain is reliable? So for example, if I need to really push, I've got a deadline, I'm writing something and I really, really, really have to push to hit that deadline. Do I trust that my brain can meet that demand? And do I trust that it can meet that demand without me burning out and that I can recover afterwards? So for me, it's those three components that come together to give a sense of brain health, good brain health.
And that's fascinating, because there seems to be a lot of pressure on that, all of it, doesn't it? I mean, I don't know about you, but focus, concentration, I'm genuinely concerned about things like cognitive decline in the future, what's going to happen as I age. It just feels like we're in this moment now where, the brain's having to go through quite a lot.
Well, it is. What's really interesting is that we often talk about the brain in relation to symptoms, but then we don't really connect those symptoms to the organ. So it's like going to your doctor and saying, oh, I'm having palpitations, I feel faint, sometimes my heart is beating like crazy, and your doctor going, okay, yeah, sure, let's talk about your palpitations, let's talk about your breathlessness, but let's not talk about your heart health. Let's not give you any information about how your diet or your exercise or your cigarette smoking might be affecting the way that your heart is working, the health of your heart, and how that translates to your symptoms. And so what happens with brain health, whether we're talking about things like depression, anxiety, or things like poor concentration, we separate the symptoms from the organ. And so you come in to your psychologist or your GP and you say, I'm feeling flat, I'm feeling low, I feel as if my emotions aren't responsive to the things that are happening around me. And you might have a conversation about stress, anxiety or depression, but we are unlikely to have is a conversation about your brain health and how your brain health underlies or contributes to the symptoms that you're experiencing. So there's still this real separation between how we think about the brain and mental health and that we don't connect.
That's such an interesting point because, of course, those things are connected. And when you talk about the organ, of course, this organ has its own needs, doesn't it, for food and nutrition. And that's very much your specialty. So how is it different?
Well, one of the things that I think we miss, don't know, ignore, overlook is that the brain is the hungriest organ in the body, is the single biggest contributor to your basal metabolic rate, right? So when people are calculating their basal metabolic rate, if they're wanting to go on a calorie restricted diet, work out their calories in versus their calories out, they try and work out this little calculation, this equation to work out, okay, how much is my body burning? How many calories is my body burning in the day? But your brain is the biggest single contributor to that. Your brain is burning through something like 20% of all of the calories that your body is using at rest. And so we have this organ that is constantly burning through energy and nutrients, but we never think about its needs. And then it's an organ that underlies everything about you and everything that you want, right? Your hopes, your dreams, your ambitions, your goals, your ability to be social. That's my starting point. The brain is the hungriest organ in the body, and it relies on certain nutrients that we can't really kind of generate in the body, which is really odd. Right? Because you have this really important organ that cannot store energy. It doesn't have a backup energy store. It's quite fragile. And it depends for its structure on nutrients that can only come from the diet, that cannot be generated anywhere else. And that are very, very hard for it to kind of synthesize and make from precursors. And what that tells us is that there are certain nutrients that when our brains were developing that were really abundant in the environment, that were just everywhere, almost unavoidable, and they have these special properties, and the brain uses these special properties. So one of the big ones is omega-3 fatty acids, EPA and DHA. Now EPA largely gets broken down into compounds that resolve inflammation. They're literally called resolvins, maricins and so on. So when we think about inflammation, like a fire that kind of burns and then dies out, but it's not like that. It's much more like a light switch. When you get an infection or an injury, your inflammatory response is turned on and then it has to be turned off, and the switch that turns it off is made from EPA. They're made from those omega-3 fatty acids. And because your brain is, we can think about it almost as a kind of pro-inflammatory, pro-oxidative environment, because it's made of these very unsaturated fats that can be very easily oxidized. We need EPAs to do that. And then DHA is the structural fat. They're like the bricks in your house. So if your brain was a house, maybe 1 in every 3 bricks is made of this DHA. And the special property about it is that it's incredibly flexible in its structure, and it helps to conduct electricity. And that's why no other fat can substitute for it. There are other fats that are easier to make in the body. There are other fats that are much more abundant, but they don't have these special properties that allow the brain to send these electrical signals and to allow your brain cells to be lovely and flexible so that they can do all of that very high metabolically active stuff.
Do you think maybe one of the challenges with mental health is that we don't see what's happening inside us? Like, I use this analogy of like when you cut yourself or you bruise yourself, it's very visible. You can see that you're hurt, but it's so easy to ignore what's happening inside your brain.
100%. So the original title of Unprocessed was Out of Sight, Out of Mind, because that's how I think we see or think about the brain. It's so much more compelling to when you're trying to talk to anybody about health, right? If you're trying to be like, hey, I've got some ideas for what you might want to do for your health, it's so much easier if I can show you a before and after, right? Welcome to Kimberley's 12-week body blitz, and there's a picture of me looking sad and unhappy. in my before picture, and then 12 weeks later, here's this transformation. And you can see it. We're a hugely visual species. A lot of the brain is dedicated to processing visual information. It's easy to see. It's easy to understand. It's easy to use that as motivation, and then to track your progress, right? You can take measurements or whatever. It is so hard to do that with the brain. In my talks, I actually do present slides of the brain. I show what an Alzheimer's disease brain looks like compared to a healthy brain, to try to make it much more visual. But it's so subjective and it can be really subtle. So for example, we know that iron deficiency, which is one of the most common deficiencies, particularly of women of childbearing age, is really associated with lots of psychological concerns. So things like depression and anxiety are linked to iron deficiency, because iron is a cofactor. It's like a worker that puts together raw ingredients to make a product in a factory, right? That's the cofactor. So if your brain is trying to turn a raw ingredient into serotonin, trying to turn a precursor amino acid into serotonin, you need cofactors, the workers on that factory floor, like iron, like phosphorus, like calcium, like vitamin C, to do that transformation.
And tell us about serotonin. Sorry, what does that do? Yes.
So serotonin is a neurotransmitter, also a neuromodulator, but it's a brain signaling chemical that plays a role in mood regulation. So it's not quite as simple as saying more serotonin and you're happy, less serotonin and you're sad, but it plays a role in kind of preparing your brain cells for other signals and helping to regulate your mood. So really important if we want to feel as best we can. And it's the neurotransmitter that is the target of antidepressant medications, SSRIs. And so if you're not getting enough iron, a couple of things are happening. Right? First of all, you're going to have this really slow translation, this slow conversion of those precursors, those building blocks into your serotonin. But also, remember that your brain cells are working very, very hard. They're like a furnace that needs fuel, wood, for example, and oxygen to burn. And iron helps your body to move oxygen around. Helps you, that's what it's there for. So you're going to get less oxygen. You're going to get slower metabolism, slower activity in those brain cells. And that's why we see low mood, mental fatigue, depression in people with iron deficiency. And the reason that that's important is because if you don't know that, then you turn up to your GP and you say, I'm feeling really depressed, I'm feeling really low. If your GP isn't going to say, let's have a quick blood test, let's look at what your diet is doing, you're going to end up with a prescription for medication or being sent to see a psychologist, when actually we might be dealing with fundamentally a nutritional or physiological issue.
That's so interesting. I mean, there's so much chat about don't just change your diet overnight without getting proper professional advice. And I have a teenage boy who just decided to be vegetarian for 2 years, and I had no idea what I was doing. So, he started displaying all sorts of symptoms of fatigue and lethargy and depression. And it was just that we weren't working with all his nutrients. So that struck home massively. You say something else that's quite interesting in your book, which is you describe prevention is better than cure using an earthquake effect. Is that like some sort of earthquake analogy?
Yeah.
And it would be great to hear about that, because I think that's a really important point.
I think one of the things that I see happening in mental health that again that doesn't happen in physical health, kind of neck down health almost, is that we completely ignore prevention. So when we're talking to children, like if we're trying to teach children to brush their teeth, one of the things you say is, if you don't brush your teeth, then you can get holes in your teeth and maybe your teeth fall out. It's really important to prevent that. Or when you're talking to teenagers about not smoking, it's bad for your teeth, it's bad for your skin, and it increases your risk of cancer. We're all about prevention. When it comes to mental health, though, that is not what we do. When it comes to mental health, we wait for the disaster to strike first. We wait for the depression. We wait for the panic attacks. We wait for the burnout. And then we say, let's see if we can get you back to work. Let's see if we can get you well enough to to function. So only in mental health, really, do we wait for the disaster before we intervene.
Certainly, mental health was not a topic that was on the tip of everyone's tongues when I was growing up in India. But even now, there are certain taboos in society where, we're just not chatting
We're
about
just
these
not.
things. No.
And so I really take the idea of prevention right back to the basics. And so I'm talking about, and so the analogy I use is in Japan, the islands of Japan sit within what's called the ring of fire, these tectonic plates that are constantly moving. And that's why there are kind of volcanoes and earthquakes. They know that fundamentally they have vulnerabilities. And they've had lots of earthquakes that have been devastating across the century. And so what they do now with their buildings, it's not that they say, let's not build anything over 2 stories. They say, let's improve the structure of the building. We use thicker concrete beams, we reinforce things, but also we have special foundations. The foundations they use essentially are shock absorbers, and they stop the shock of an earthquake reverberating up the side of the building. So they've gone right back to the foundations. How can we make our buildings more resilient right from the first brick, the first pouring of concrete? And that's what I think we need to be doing with the brain, going right back to first principles. Most of the development of the brain happens in the first 1,000 days. That's, well, I say conception. We need to think preconception, because the brain starts developing very early in conception, within about 8 weeks. So often before a woman really knows she's pregnant, the neural tube is already developing. So her nutritional status at conception is really important. But the brain then is doing a lot of its development in that first 1,000 days, and then around the age of 5 as well. So these are our foundations. This is where we need to be thinking. No, we can't completely make anybody immune from the earthquakes of life, right? We know that there will be shocks. We will experience sadness and bereavement and loss and rejection. But how do we make that brain as resilient as possible structurally from as early as possible? And that starts with prenatal, pregnancy, and early life nutrition.
Which makes complete sense, of course. I think now might be a good time to talk about what the modern diet is doing to us, Kimberley. This is the mic drop moment. I know. So yes, ultra-processed food and the way we eat today, what's that actually doing? And most importantly, your book, I think, came out 2 years ago. And I want to know what you've seen in those 2 years.
Let's just take one single nutrient. Let's start with those omega-3s, which are found in oily fish. So sardines, salmon, anchovies, herring, that kind of thing. I left mackerel out because our mackerel stores need to be replenished at the moment.
Yes, if they're coming from a certain part, yes.
So we want to
well done.
Protect the fish stocks. And it's these foods that we think are really abundant, and things like oysters and mussels and the shellfish, which are really rich in particular nutrients that the brain really loves. In order to get enough, which we think is in the region of about 3.5 grams of omega-3s per week, about 500 milligrams per day, you need to be eating about 2 portions of oily fish a week, or 1 good serving of mackerel would do it. Whereas we know that adults in the UK are eating 1 portion of oily fish per month. We already have one nutrient well established that it's essential for brain health, well established that it really supports brain function, that it might have a role to play in major depressive disorder that hardly anybody is getting enough of. It's the same story with fibre. 90% of people aren't getting enough fibre. Things like iodine. So iodine is, the World Health Organization calls it the leading cause of preventable brain damage worldwide. It's well established that insufficient iodine in the diet leads to permanently suppressed IQ. And yet recent data tells us that both in the UK and Ireland, somewhere in the region of 60 to 70% of pregnant women aren't getting enough. We get iodine from seafood. We are island nations.
Isn't that just a travesty?
So these are nutrients that are well established in the research literature, World Health Organization, that are essential for the brain that we're not eating. And I think part of that is a movement away from traditional foods, wherever you are from. Because actually a lot of the data on food quality is really about traditional foods, home cooked foods, whole foods, fiber-rich foods, lots of plants. And it almost doesn't matter where you're from, whether that's Nordic diet, the Japanese diet, the Mediterranean diet, these diets that are rich in beans in Central and South America, that kind of thing. We're really thinking about traditional foods because they are the nutrient-dense foods, and your brain has this huge requirement for nutrients. So the modern diet is a problem because what we know is that as soon as you process a food, you lose some of its nutrients. So when you process whole wheat into white flour, you immediately lose something like 70-80% of the magnesium just in that one fell swoop. We know, for example, that they've just started to fortify white flour products with folic acid because you lose that folic acid when you process the whole grain into the refined grain. They're not fortifying wholemeal flour. So as soon as you process a product, you lose some of the nutrition. And so much of our diets are processed foods. We think something like certainly over 55%, 60-70%, depending on what population you're looking at.
It's actually worse in children, which is the shocker.
It's kind of 80% in children, isn't it?
In the UK, yes. Isn't that just appalling given what you're saying?
When their brains need the most nutrition. So the higher the proportion of your diet is ultra-processed food, the lower your nutritional status. We see this in big cohort studies coming out of Brazil and the US. So the more ultra-processed foods you're eating, the lower your levels of omega-3, of vitamin A, of magnesium, of selenium, of zinc, of B12, folic acid. And so automatically, just the nature of the ultra-processed food or a diet high in ultra-processed foods, it's creating insufficiency in nutrient status and nutrient in. And that's the problem. I'm not here to say that a single Kit Kat is gonna hurt you, is gonna be a problem, or that you shouldn't eat birthday cake. Like, not at all. I'm a former bake-off baker. I'm not going to tell you not to eat cake. But it's about the proportion, and it's about having your baselines covered. It's about saying, what does my brain need? How do I make sure it gets those things at baseline? And then on top, I can have my fun foods. Then on top, I can, go out and have afternoon tea and live my life. I need to make sure I'm covering my bases. It's like budgeting for a household. You need to make sure that you've covered your mortgage and your bills before you go on a holiday to Mexico. If you're spending the rent money on the holiday, then you're gonna get into trouble.
Cooking is obviously very close to my heart, your heart as well. And isn't there something else about cooking, which is that it's very relaxing?
I do think so. And I think it's a real shame that cooking is being sold to us. And I really mean sold to us. I read it and then I couldn't remember the reference. But there was basically it was almost like a shareholders meeting of one of the big food delivery companies. And they were banking on millennials and Gen Z not being able to cook. They were like, this is our golden ticket. These people can't cook. And that means that they are ripe for our market, for our product. And as what you see, I mean, even some of them, I don't think it was this particular company, but they're literally called, say, don't cook, just eat, right? It's an instruction. And so what you see is cooking being characterized as hard, a waste of time, boring, confusing, overwhelming, and that it's a problem, and the solution to your problem is both convenience, whether that's kind of prepackaged foods or delivery. And I think it's a real shame because actually being able to cook, even if it's just a handful of meals, is a life skill.
Totally. I tell my kids that the whole time. It's like if you need to know how to swim, someone pushes you off a boat, you need to be able to swim to shore, after a party on a boat. Very random. But in the same way, if you come home and there's bits and bobs in your fridge, you should be able to knock up a meal. It's a fundamental life skill. So it's such an important point. So you've talked about fats. So we've talked about omega-3, DHA. We've talked about minerals, so iodine and magnesium. Is there anything else that is great for brain health?
Yes, so there are a couple of things. One of the big ones where there's really beautiful data is leafy green vegetables. So that's your kale, your rocket, spinach, chard, those leafy greens, Savoy cabbage, what we see is a couple of things. So one really kind of influential study showed that people who had one serving of greens per day, so a small cereal bowls worth of leafy greens, compared to people who didn't eat leafy greens in their later years, had brains that were 11 years younger.
Wow.
They're so protective. And then another study looked at literally the levels of these nutrients in the brains, or kind of post-mortem brains, basically. And what they found was that the levels of these nutrients were 50% lower in the brains of people who died with Alzheimer's disease compared to people who died with healthy brains. So we really think these nutrients are really neuroprotective. They help to reduce oxidative stress, lower that kind of inflammation that happens in the brain. So leafy greens, and they don't have to be raw. We're not talking about like eating loads of raw kale, because
that's a relief.
not fun. But things like adding spinach into a curry would absolutely do it. Spanakopita, one of my favourite, like Greek pies, spinach and those mixed greens, that would do it. Adding some frozen spinach to a smoothie, that would do it. So leafy green vegetables, and then berries. Berries, so blueberries get a lot of the headlines and a lot of the praise. It's just because they've got good PR. Other berries count as well. And particularly, I mean, if you're in the UK, I don't know where else they flourish, but elderberries have between 10 and 100 times the polyphenol power of a blueberry. And so every autumn I go picking elderberries, turn them into syrup, use them as a cordial. But what happens when you eat berries, so blueberries, raspberries, elderberries, anything that ends with berry, black currants and red currants, is that when you consume them and that your body breaks them down, they produce a gas which increases the flexibility of your blood vessels. And you have 400 miles of blood vessels in your brain. They are like the roads in a busy city. And so what you're doing is almost adding an extra lane to those roads, which allows the traffic to flow more freely, right? It allows more nutrients and oxygen and glucose to flow in and more waste to come out. So it just makes the whole brain much more efficient within about 90 minutes. And what we see is improvements in memory, in task switching, in sustained attention in people who consume these polyphenol-rich foods.
That is fascinating. Now, I'm guessing that there isn't a pill we can pop that just takes care of all of this amazing brain stuff.
I'm so sorry.
Oh, no.
I'm so
You
sorry.
broke my heart.
You know, it's a really common question because people find food overwhelming. And it needn't be, but I understand why it feels that way. There's a lot of conflicting information. There are lots of things we're told to eat and not to eat, and certain times when we should be eating, and all of this sort of stuff. The thing is, there are so many more nutrients in a whole food that haven't even probably been identified. You know, the kind of plant compounds in an apple that might be good for the brain, might be full of different types of fiber that support the gut. We haven't really identified. And even if we could, we couldn't really synthesize them, you know, make them in a lab. They might be too volatile. They might fall apart. We don't know how they interact with other things. It's so complex. But what we know is that we've evolved to eat whole foods. What we know is that food nutrients work in synergy. So for example, in a piece of fish, you get omega-3s, but you also get B vitamins. And B vitamins help the body to absorb that omega-3. And so in that piece of fish, they come together, which you won't get if you're simply just taking an omega-3 supplement. So ideally, we want to be food first, and where that's not possible, so in the fish example, if you don't want to, can't eat fish, if you're allergic, if you're vegan or plant-based, then you'd be looking at ways to use pills to supplement, to fill those gaps. But we all want to be food first.
Ideally getting it from food. That is very useful actually to know and to have you communicate it like that. Now, two things. One is you write a great Substack newsletter, which I've very much been enjoying. So we must spread the joy and the love for that. And the second thing is you have a new BBC Sounds podcast, don't you, called Complex.
Yes.
And so are you covering this sort of thing in more detail so we can tune in?
Well, we're not actually talking about food. So Complex is really about the other side of my work, which is what is going on with mental health information online?
Hey, yeah, great. No, no, we're into
it's,
that too.
it's talking about, it's taking all of these issues that we all experience, things like from anything from like a procrastination and perfectionism to OCD and bipolar disorder, where online you can get lots of kind of different, again, conflicting information. Some of it evidence-based, some of it not very good at all. I sit with, so I'm a practicing counselling psychologist. I sit with another expert who's a specialist in that area, and we give you trusted information, expert advice that you can trust, that you can believe in, and that is full of nuance. It isn't just saying if you leave a cupboard door open it means you've got ADHD, these sorts of things that we see and that are really unhelpful for people. We walk you really gently through what is this diagnosis, what does it mean, what is the actual prevalence, how does it show up, how can you help yourself, and how can you help those around you.
It sounds fantastic, and we will all be tuning in now. Kimberley, you've been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for coming along.
Thank you.
And
My absolute pleasure.
wasn't she great? Now, if you enjoyed this, please don't forget to like, share, subscribe, tell all your friends, and see you here for the next one. Bye.